Welcome to the VBCS Owners Forum. I'd like to start by introducing myself. So my name is Richard Eastwood. So I'm the State Manager for Victoria Body Corporate Services. I'm also the Executive General Manager for Smarter Communities. I have over 20 years experience. I started in VBCS the year 2000. In my role, I've been everything from a community manager right the way through to state manager and general manager. So a wide and varied experience in strata. I also have got an involvement in the SCA. So the SCA is our national peak body. So they look after and they influence government. That's the peak body for our organisation. So I'm on the national task force. I also in Victoria am a member of the committees and some of those influencing groups. I'm really pleased to be able to talk on behalf of VBCS, but obviously talking on behalf of Victoria, because what we have seen is one of the most substantial changes in owners corporation legislation that we've seen, obviously, in decades. So the owners corporation changes, the legislative changes, basically are about the type of buildings that we're looking after in terms of size, and also some of the decision-making processes that occur. So very substantial changes that impact on the owners corporation and owners, of course, being at the pivot and the main point of that. The last time that the legislation was, or the Act was written was 2006. So it's been a substantial time. Along the journeys, there have been some modifications, but nowhere near as substantial as a rewriting of the legislation that has occurred now. It did, and it was impacted by COVID, and also by influencing by the SCA to be able to make some changes to it. But ultimately, what we have seen and what we will be seeing in December is some substantial changes for owners. The most significant, I think, and probably in the overall structure, is going to be a recognition of the type of buildings that we're looking for. And when I'm talking type, I'm talking size. So when we're talking about structure, historically, there's only been two types of owners corporations, 2 through to 100, based on management fee, but then over 100, so normal and prescribed. The change in legislation turns around and it says, okay, we can go from blocks of 2, we can go to those ones that are over 100, but there's obviously some classifications that sit underneath it. So different requirements for different buildings. Importantly, also looking at whether it's an occupiable lot or whether it's a non-occupiable. And by non-occupiable, we're talking about car parks, we're talking about storage cages, we're talking about things that are not occupied by owners and by residents. Part of the requirement, obviously, in the tiering is about saying, okay, we need to differentiate depending on the size of buildings by the financial requirements. No need for a block of 2 to have the same requirements as over. And so you can see the legislation changes talk about the accounting and the financial services. The amount of money that owners corporations hold in their bank accounts is substantial. So the government wanted to make sure that they're protecting the funds and the way in which they're transacted. So what you can see is changes to the auditing process. It used to be before only larger sites required auditing. Now that tiering moves down and the requirements move down depending on the size of the building. So a relatively substantial change, an impost on us as managers, but ultimately to the value and to the benefit of the client base. The other important thing when we're talking about buildings is the maintenance plans. And so we see everything from every building virtually needing to make sure that it's keeping up to date with the requirements and to be able to have a plan to be able to fund what it's looking to do. So you can see from this slide that the maintenance plans, which used to be only for larger buildings, have cascaded their way down. And I think that's a positive. Larger buildings, smaller buildings still need to do maintenance. They still need a plan of what they're supposed to do, and they obviously need to be able to fund that as they move through. So really very much a positive plan and a positive way for owners corporations to move through. What we're also seeing, in one of the primary things that sits with, I suppose, owners corporations is the budgeting phase. And what we have seen before and what the owners corporation legislation is about is protecting the rights of the owners. And what it can do, one of the elements of it anyway, is on the insurance claims. So it's making sure that the right people are paying for the requirements and paying and giving some certainty to owners about who is paying what. At the moment, the legislation doesn't really cover it. Now the changes put it in legislation. So therefore, it's much easier for us to manage, much easier for owners to understand. Committees is also important. We know that buildings, for example, most of the time, you probably expect a 10% turnout at an AGM. What we have seen with a committee and also with attendance of meeting, you're seeing some changes to legislation that writes down, prescribes what needs to happen, and therefore it's much easier for them to run. They've also looked at the sizing of committees. It used to be, or the limiting of the sizing enables the owners corporation to be able to function much better, much more focused. You can alter that, as you can see, up to 12, but generally speaking, they're looking at a 7. So a more manageable group. And also proxies are critically important in that. They also recognise that decision-making is important, and not all owners obviously are attending the meetings, as I mentioned before. So we need to make sure that we cover those things off, and you can see how that happens. Expenditure are critical things that need to be going and need, I suppose, a bigger decision-making process. Smaller decisions can be made, and the buildings can still function without necessarily having that requirement. Proxy farming is something that has happened in the past, or use of proxies has happened in the past. Now what you're seeing is, from a legislative requirement, a tightening up of that regulation. One of the struggles for owners corporations has also been litigation. If we are looking at taking legal action, or an OC is looking at taking legal action, they've actually made it easier for the owners corporation to do that. Still with resolutions, but they've made it easier for that to happen. We can also debt recovery, able to recoup costs to the owners corporation and to the owners corporation manager for what they do. So a substantial change, very much a positive one. Changing of rules and the requirements of rules, it allows owners to be able to set the agenda for their properties. So rules and passing rules has been adapted, and in a positive way, to be able to make sure that owners are able to, as you can see there, have quiet enjoyment while things are going on around them. So much more a community-based requirement, perhaps, than has been there in the past. The important thing too, from a community perspective, is that owners' rights are protected when it comes to what goes on at a property. You can see that from the second point. Tobacco smoke, in some cases, considered relatively minor, but it allows a protection mechanism for owners to be able to make sure that rights are protected. Insurance is another substantial change. What it does do, and you can see that they've increased the public liability up to 20 million. As a company, we've had 20 million for a number of years, but it is enshrining that in legislation, so therefore it's protected. Importantly too, is the insurance costs can be passed on to an individual owner if there is an inherent risk in a particular tenant or in a particular commercial site. That's passed on to the owners themselves. The whole world's moving to more sustainability and being more aware of the environment. Once again, legislation is recognising that, and owners corporations cannot stand in the way of owners that are making their own individual choices. One of the things that does occur quite often in tribunals, and generally speaking in VCAT in Victoria, is abandoned goods. Changes to the legislation give you much more certainty about what you can and can't do. Because of the number of cases that have been held, the owners corporation legislation has reflected that and made subtle changes to be able to enable everyone to be understanding what their rights are and to be able to enforce them. And so you can see, if abandoned goods is blocking access, all of that stuff can be absolutely removed with much more certainty than probably sat there in the past. What we do and what legislation is also quite good at doing is saying, okay, if there is a dispute, either an owner or a resident, you always got the opportunity to be able to go to VCAT and be able to take action. So it's a very critical part that not only is the owners corporation able to act, but also individual owners, tenants, if they feel that they've been disenfranchised, are able to do something about taking action against that. I think the changes to the legislation are very much a positive thing. I think the SCA has done an excellent job about being able to influence and to be able to make those rules usable. I think the next period of time are going to be very much a positive for the strata community into Victoria. So very much in favour of the changes to legislation. The sooner they can come on board, the better off I'll be. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.